Is your heart racing? This is just the tip of the iceberg. Subscribe to our channel, and don't miss a single thrilling twist in Grace's story. Chapter 27: Strangers in the Night. The thought of Lucas with Kat propelled Grace down the corridor. The storm raging outside made the lights flicker just as she passed the nurse's station and turned toward the treatment rooms. Nothing. They were dark and empty. Beyond them lay a linen closet, Eve Warden's office and the rec room. The door to the recreation room stood closed, but she heard the murmur of voices beyond. Grace hesitated, looked around for any possible weapon. Nothing. She glanced back over her shoulder to the nurse's station, but before she could make a move in that direction, the door behind her flew open and a pair of hands pulled her inside, another pair fastening around her face, closing over her nose and mouth. "Do you remember Tambora?" Jimmy asked Alex. "Sure, the big volcano that blew up when I was a baby. It was only 5 years ago, lad. Don't go making me feel older than I am." Alex just looked at him with a quizzical expression. Jimmy sighed. He was an old man compared to this lad. Compared to everyone, he guessed. That was the second time that volcano exploded. The first time, in 1816, it caused the year without a summer. Thousands around the world starved. Did a lot of people die when it blew up again? Alex asked, and Jimmy realized that a 5-year-old trapped inside a hospital, critically ill, probably wasn't hooked into CNN. Jimmy nodded. Yes. But a lot more were saved. Because Grace figured out how Maeve saved her people when that other volcano exploded. When she found the treasure. Jimmy grinned and ran his fingers through Alex's hair. Smart lad. You see, Maeve left a map, a clue to where the treasure was hidden in case future generations needed it. But she was buried by all that water. Did you get her back? I wish. That's what I wanted to try, but it proved too dangerous. Too expensive as well, but the boy didn't need to know that. We tried to rescue Maeve's grave, but in the end we had to content ourselves with the photos and few pieces we were able to retrieve. The rest we had to sacrifice, bury with Phil so that we could save the other tombs. Otherwise, the entire island threatened to collapse back into the water. Poor Maeve. Now she has to stay down there, all alone. I'm thinking she's not minding the peace and quiet. And she still did her part, even from beyond the grave. You see, after Tambora blew again, I knew that whatever Maeve had done could be done even better now with modern technology, maybe save millions from starvation. Guess you could say I became obsessed, searching out every ancient record with a scrap of Maeve's story, trying to find the facts hidden among the fiction. He smiled. After Tambora, Grace had spent several weeks on a disaster relief mission. When she returned, she became as obsessed as he was with finding Maeve's treasure. Working side by side, she'd ferret out obscure references, following arcane snippets of information with a mind as nimble and agile as her body. Those had been some of the best days of his life, but he now regretted them. Wasting all that time, when they could have been exploring each other instead of mysteries 3 millennia old. Of course, back then, they'd thought they had forever, thought what they were doing would save the world. Jimmy shifted his position, stretched his legs out, hugging Alex to his chest so hard the boy squirmed for breathing room. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice, wouldn't let anything distract him from what was important this time. Turns out, Grace had the answer all along. 2 men pulled Grace into the darkened rec room. She blinked as the lights snapped on, blinding her for a moment. Kat lay on the green felt pool table, her nightgown billowing out, the triangle holding the balls positioned over her head like a colorful crown. She was pale, but her chest rose and fell with comforting steadiness. A woman stood on each side of Kat, their hands clutched before them, 2 ladies in waiting. A large black man approached Grace, slapping a pool cue across his palm. He glowered down at her as she struggled with her captors. Then he spoke. This is the bitch the beast wants so bad. Grace almost laughed. The man's no really, only a boy, she saw on closer inspection. Voice emerged in a shrill whistle. Like a squeaker toy that a dog had gnawed and torn apart. She shrugged free of her two guards and spun around to look at them. One was Mr. Atomic, his Adam's apple bobbing in time with his pulse. From the size of his jugular veins, he looked about ready to pop. The other was a bald-headed man, who seemed more interested in staring down her top than trying to restrain her. She turned back to the teenager. Somehow he seemed to be the one in charge. "I'm Grace Moran," she told him. "The beast, as you call him, is named Lucas Redding. He tried to kill me once." She took a step closer to the boy, snagged the pool cue, halting its downward arc, and stared him in the eye. He failed. The room was silent for a moment. The two women turned to look at each other, then stepped forward to examine Grace, as if she were a museum exhibit. "Really?" The young one, Angie, said. "You got away from the beast." "How? What happened?" The older one asked with a skeptical look. Grace watched as the bald man snagged the woman by the waist, dragging her away from Grace. From the possessive look he gave the woman, it appeared that he worried that she might be somehow contaminated by Grace's victory over the man who had tried to kill her. The woman looked down at the floor, her long blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, shuffling her feet. Angie gave her a superior glance, then sidled up to stroke the teenager's muscular arm. He squinted his eyes at Grace in what she was certain he thought was a look of intimidation, releasing his grip on the cue stick to pull Angie close to him. "What do you want?" Grace asked, pivoting so that she stood between the pool table and the others. Freaks, Kat had called them. She saw now how right the girl had been. She leaned back against the table, hoping to block their view of Kat, twirling the pool cue in her hands as if it was a baton. "Look here, lady," the bald man said, shoving his woman behind him, putting her back in her place. "The beast runs this place. If he wants you, he gets you. And whoever gives you to him." He licked his lips, his gaze dropping to Grace's breasts once more. "Well, let's just say that there's rewards awaiting." Grace's stomach clenched as she saw him look past her to Kat's still form, his hand dropping to his crotch in a not-so-subtle message. She risked a glance in Kat's direction herself, and saw that one of the balls in the wooden rack above her head was missing. Kat's hands were both hidden beneath the folds of her nightgown. 2 against 5, at least the odds were getting better. The bald man and the teenager were the two they'd have to worry about. The others would follow their lead. Grace began tossing the cue stick from one hand to the next, keeping a hypnotic rhythm as she spoke. All eyes were on her, exactly where she wanted them focused. "All right," she said calmly. "So now you've got me here. What are you going to do?" The men exchanged glances, as if they'd never expected their plan to make it this far. "Take you to the beast," the teenager squeaked. "He's waiting." Grace purposely almost missed catching the cue, shifting her weight as she leaned to the side to grab it. The men didn't mirror her sudden movement, if anything they relaxed as if she posed no threat. "You're going to waltz me down the hall, past Dr. Warden's office, past the clerk, past the nurse's station, and into a locked ward." She tossed the stick high, snagged it on the way down without even looking. "And you're going to do that, how?" Baldy stepped to the plate. "We'll tie you up, gag you, roll you down the hall in a laundry cart," he said in a voice undercut by glee. She shot him a glance, wondering how someone with such predatory fantasies ended up on an unlocked co-ed ward. "We can't do that," Mr. Atomic protested. "Everyone knows what we look like, we'll never make it past the station." "Yeah, we need a disguise," Squeaky added. The 3 men huddled together, the women joining them. "No," Angie said. "What we need is a distraction." The older woman placed her hand on her hip and vamped, rubbing her body against Baldy's. "Sounds like a job for a real woman," not a walking stick. Hey, who you calling? We can still tie her up. I'll do it. No, I will. Grace barely heard their heated discussion as she reached a hand behind her. The smooth roundness of a pool ball was instantly slapped into it. She nodded her head. Hey, guys, Atomic was the only one who paid her heed, whirling to her. Give us a minute. Whatever you say. Before he could turn back to the others, she whipped the heavy ball at him. It collided against his head with a satisfying smack. He dropped to the ground, scattering the others. The two women immediately dove for cover behind the love seat, but the other two men still stood between Grace and Kat and the door. Grace was thankful that the other pool cues were safely in the rack behind them at the far end of the room, leaving the men with no weapons other than their fists and feet. I'm gonna kick your ass from here to the point and back, Squeaky said, his hands balling into fists the size of Easter hams. Not if I get her first, Baldy said, stepping over Atomic to get to Grace. Grace sidestepped away from the table, giving herself more room and leading the men away from Kat. Then she swung out with the pool cue, now gripping it like a warrior's staff. She hoped that all those kung fu movies she'd watched over the years had taught her something. She squared her shoulders. Attitude, just like handling drunks in the ER. It was all in the attitude. The pool cue whistled through the air, harmlessly bouncing off Baldy's arm as he raised it to block the blow. It continued its arc towards the ground and he lunged for it, trying to grab it from her and pull her off balance. Squeaky waited, arms crossed over his broad chest, a smirk on his face as if he'd enjoy the outcome no matter who won the contest. Grace swung the pool cue just beyond Baldy's grasp, drawing him out, and then immediately reversed its course, ramming it up between his legs. An inhuman yelp emerged from him as he crumpled to the ground. No longer content to wait, Squeaky rushed her from the side. She choked up on her grip and aimed the cue against the side of his head. Run! She called to Kat. Grace's blow slammed against Squeaky's skull with a vibration that shot through the cue, almost making her drop it. He merely shook it off and grinned at her. Oh no. Something told her he'd been in street fights before. She watched as Kat rolled off the table and ran to the door. Go Kat, get to Alex's room, Grace called as Squeaky grabbed the other end of the cue and was using her own weapon to force her back up against the pool table. He was snarling now, drool slipping from his mouth. He yanked the stick from her and raised it high over his head, about to bring it crashing down on her. A leaden thunk echoed through the room, and a yellow ball ricocheted from Squeaky's skull onto the floor. Squeaky froze, his eyes wide with shock. Then, almost in slow motion, the cue slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor. His knees bent and he sank to the floor beside it. That's for calling me stupid. Kat yelled in triumph. Grace leapt over his body and ran to the door. The women still cowered, hands over their mouths as they stared at their fallen comrades. Grace grabbed Kat by the waist and hauled the girl out of the room. Come on, we've got to get out of here. Chapter 28 Volcano Weather. Together they ran down the hallway and through the dark skyway to the safety of the annex. Only then did they stop for air. Grace pushed the button for the elevator while Kat danced around the lobby, her bare feet slapping on the linoleum. Grace glanced back over to the skyway. No one pursued them. Ha! Did you see that? Kat cackled in glee, tossing the 8-ball from one hand to the other. Could have told them not to mess with me. I was shortstop on our little league team, can throw better than both my brothers. The elevator dinged its arrival. Grace hustled Kat on before the girl got any ideas about returning to the scene of her pitching debut. Grace felt no sense of triumph, only a deep-seated relief that they had escaped. Kat paced the confines of the small metal box for a few moments before suddenly sagging against the wall, as if all the air had been sucked from her lungs. Damn it, that scared the crap out of me. She leaned forward, resting her hand on her knee, her chest heaving. "I think I'm gonna puke." Grace pulled Kat to her feet, wrapped her arms around the girl. Kat shook uncontrollably. The elevator stopped. They emerged into the dim shadows of the pediatrics floor. "It's all right," she said as Kat began to sob. "You did fine, I'm proud of you, Kat. You saved my life. Everything's all right now." Finally, Kat stopped crying and looked up. "I did? Really? I saved your life?" Grace smiled down at the girl, used the hem of her scrub top to wipe away the tears. "You did. I've never known anyone as brave as you, Kat." "Wow. I mean wow." Kat blew out her breath. "You won't tell Alex that I cried, will you?" "Course not. And it happens to everyone. It's just the adrenaline. Even soldiers and cops cry after something like that, sometimes throw up, too." "Ha. At least I didn't puke." They started down the hall to Alex's room when Kat tugged on Grace's arm. "I'm sorry about what I said earlier, Grace. I was wrong, they don't want to die, they are already dead. Inside at least. And you're not like them, not at all." Grace hugged Kat to her, as she paused in the doorway of Alex's room before entering. She felt a smile widen across her face at the sight of Jimmy and Alex sitting together on the bed, Jimmy's arm around the boy, as if they were father and son. They'd talked about children, thought that after they were settled. She shook her head, following Kat into the room. Kat plopped into the chair beside Alex's bed, hugging her knees to her chest, still flushed by their near escape. "Kat, are you all right?" Alex asked. "You should have seen it, Alex." Grace kicked butt. What she means to say, Grace interrupted before Kat's too vivid imagination went wild, is that the other patients in the ECU won't be bothering Kat anytime soon. Grace brushed by Jimmy, who snagged her by the waist and pulled her close to him. "You all right?" he asked, his eyes narrowed in concern. "I'm fine." She bent over and kissed the top of his head. "Really?" He gave her a squeeze before releasing her. "Jimmy was telling me how Maeve saved the world," Alex said. "She found the lost treasure of Atlantis." Kat looked up, eager to hear more, not complaining as Grace wrapped a blanket around her. Grace glanced over at Jimmy. "You can't tell him that story," she protested, remembering how her stomach had curdled when they had discovered Maeve's secret. "It's not for kids." "What about the?" Jimmy waved a hand, dismissing her concerns. "Nah, kids love that stuff." Grace grimaced, hoping he'd translate the dark tale of cannibalism and bloodlust into something that wouldn't give the kids nightmares. The story had disturbed the hell out of her. Maeve returning home with 2 Callistian men only to find her people following Lothar, her brother, on a path of cannibalism, preying on neighboring clans. After Lothar killed the 2 Callistians, Maeve had fought him in a fierce battle. She defeated him and his own men had pounced on him, finishing the job. The resulting blood feud had led to Maeve's own death years later. While she bathed in a lake, her nephew had murdered her. Grace shuddered at the memories of the tales, and began to stop Jimmy, but the rapt smiles on the faces of Alex and Kat, as he summarized the story about the Callista for Kat's benefit, stopped her. She perched on the radiator, leaning against the window, the cold panes of glass vibrating against her back as Jimmy continued his tale. His voice was so welcome, it lulled her into a trance as she remembered back 4 years. She smiled, her mind filled with the image of Jimmy juggling a full pint of Smithwick's, as he tried to teach her to dance at their wedding rehearsal dinner. Somehow he hadn't spilled a drop even as she tripped and stepped on his toes, finally ending up laughing, rolled up in his arm, his warmth supporting her. After that the wedding had passed in a blissful blur of a dimly lit and overheated church, followed by strange but welcoming faces, loud music, and louder laughter. Although she was anxious enough that a drink might have soothed her nerves, Grace had abstained. Several of her new in-laws had commented on this with knowing winks and toasts to Jimmy, followed by ribald jokes about him being old enough to be her father. Grace had remained silent, although her reason for not drinking wasn't the traditional bridal secret. With the help of Brother Leo and Jimmy's friend, Paddy O'Dwyer, an archaeologist with the National Museum in Dublin, she had a surprise planned for her new husband. Finally, the Saley band dwindled down to a maudlin accordion player, and one of Jimmy's cousins joining in on a tin whistle. The tales of Jimmy's childhood exploits had finished, and Grace had denied knowing new brother Mickey, or Sean or Brian. He's gone to America, lives in Boston, that's near to Pittsburgh in NT. For the umpteenth time. She had danced one last dance with Paddy, taking the keys he handed her afterwards, and snagged Jimmy's arm, dragging him away from the bar. "Time for you to see my wedding present," she had whispered in his ear when he protested that the party was only now beginning. He blushed and grinned, waving at his friends as he stumbled out the door behind her. She fumbled with the room key, suddenly afraid that she had made a terrible mistake. Could she ever hope to give Jimmy the happiness he deserved? She with her restless ways, and both of them so used to being on their own. What if he grew tired of her? What if they drifted apart like so many couples she had known? Despite his semi-intoxicated state, Jimmy seemed to effortlessly follow her thoughts. He took the key from her, opened the door, then swept her up in his arms to cross the threshold. "Our love will never die," he whispered amidst the rustle of her silk gown. They had collapsed on the bed, both too exhausted to contemplate anything more than resting in each other's arms. Grace kicked off her shoes. She swore she'd worn right through the soles with all her dancing. "Where's my present?" Jimmy roused himself enough to ask. Grace dangled Paddy's keys before him. "Paddy's lent us his boat for the week." He collapsed back on the pillows, one hand idly tracing the pearls sewn onto her bodice. "Is that all?" She felt her face stretch into a wide grin. Jimmy sat up straight, his own smile mirroring hers. "What have you done, Grace?" "I found it, Jimmy." He tilted his head, his eyes widening, creases crinkling at their edges. "No, it can't be true." She nodded. "It is. I found Maeve's treasure. I had an idea, so Paddy took me with a few of his students yesterday. I thought you were meant to be at that day spa in Galway. Getting your toes done and seaweed wraps and all." She laughed, stretching one naked foot up for him to examine. "Do I look like the pedicure type?" He shrugged. "I thought it was wedding jitters, you know." She leaned forward and kissed him thoroughly. "No jitters here." As they embraced, his hand closed over hers and he slid the keys from her fingers. "Have you seen it, actually seen it? Is it what we thought?" "After I found it, Paddy and his crew photographed it and began a grid. But he says he'll leave the rest to you. As long as you don't muck it up." Jimmy bounded out of bed faster than a kid on Christmas morning. "Muck it up. I've been working sites longer." Than he ducked under the bed. "Where are my shoes?" "What do you need shoes for?" "We'll leave tonight, sleep on the boat. Then come first light." He came up for air, his head at the level of the bed. She stretched out, took his face between her hands. "It's not going anywhere, Jimmy. Tonight is ours." They had gotten a late start the next day, and it was well past noon by the time they reached the craggy, deserted island southwest of Galway. Waves battered the small inflatable raft they used to gain access to the cave after anchoring the boat in the cove beyond it, making Grace seasick and glad she had abstained the night before. Jimmy didn't seem to mind the raucous motion of the dinghy. His face flushed with excitement, he perched on the gunwale, revving the motor, too excited to wait for the tide. Grace's eyes welled up with tears and she had to look away. Never in her life had she been able to give anyone a gift that caused such delight. Approval, gratitude, respect, but never sheer, unadulterated joy. She brushed her eyes with the back of a hand and found herself looking forward to many years of surprising and delighting Jimmy. "You okay there?" Jimmy asked, circling one hand around her waist and snuggling her back against him. Not getting seasick on me, are you? A sudden wave made the raft lurch as water sprayed both of them. Jimmy's laugh filled the air. Grace turned and risked sliding off her seat to plant a kiss on his lips. Whoa now, I could get used to this marriage thing, he said before turning his attention back to steering. The island loomed over them, a craggy grey-green mass of granite riddled with inlets and caves. The one on the right, is it? Yes. Better to wait for the tide to go out, it won't be as rough. She had to shout above the sound of waves smashing against the cliffs on either side of the opening. Jimmy laughed again and gunned the engine. No way. I've waited all my life for this. Paddy's crew had set up lights, which made navigating inside the sea cavern much easier than Grace's first time there. The ropes she'd left anchored to the granite wall inside were wet, slippery to climb. Jimmy waited impatiently below, while she scaled the slick rock face up to the ledge high up on the cavern wall. 20 meters up the group of sealed vessels waited. The air was crisp, charged with energy. Maeve's sword lay across 3 of the large clay pots. Despite the wet atmosphere, it was a gleaming color between silver and copper, with not a speck of rust to mar its surface. It looked as if its owner had left it there 3 minutes ago rather than 3,000 years ago. I'm coming. Jimmy shouted from below, not waiting for her to set up the safety ropes she brought with her. Grace dropped her gear and craned her head over the cliff's edge. The sea churned as the tide rolled in, the small dinghy bouncing like a child's toy. Jimmy balanced on the edge of the gunwale, reaching for the rope. A rogue wave blindsided him, and he careened over the side, toppling headfirst into the water. Jimmy! Her cry of warning was too late. The coil of the anchor rope tangled around Jimmy's leg as he disappeared beneath the surface. The small boat flipped over, trapping him. She didn't have time to think or plan, only to react. Ignoring Paddy's carefully laid-out grid, she grabbed Maeve's sword and dove off the cliff into the water, barely missing rocks hidden by the tide. She kicked her way toward the surface and shook her head to clear her vision. Jimmy was nowhere to be seen. White frothed water churned around the overturned dinghy. The sword was short enough that it didn't slow her much as she swam to the boat and tried to turn it over. Waves pounded her back. Sucking in a deep breath, she grabbed the line that ensnared Jimmy and dove under the boat, following it. Jimmy was a few meters below the surface, struggling with the rope tangled around his ankle and one wrist. His face was tight with panic, and he almost hit her when she approached. Then he looked at her and his panic subsided. She swiped at the ropes, cutting any that she could reach without slicing into Jimmy's flesh. To her relief, the ancient blade was still sharp, parting the thick nylon easily. Then, Jimmy's body went limp, drifting down. He was still hopelessly snarled. Grace felt her lungs burning. She wanted to scream, but she pushed her own terror aside. She grabbed Jimmy's belt with one hand as she reached into the darkness beyond him to slash at the remaining knots. Finally he floated free and she kicked hard, propelling them to the surface. Now the current helped her, launching them forward onto the small spit of gravel that edged the cave. She rolled Jimmy out of the water and onto his back. Straddling him, she checked his breathing. Nothing. She blew 2 breaths into his mouth and watched his chest rise. His pulse was there, fast, but definitely there. She sealed her lips over his and gave him another breath. This time a stream of water spewed into her face as he retched and gagged. Wiping her eyes clear, she rolled him onto his side as he continued to vomit and cough. His color was pale, but his breathing steady aside from an occasional cough. Even though he was out of danger, she could not let go of the handful of his shirt she had twisted in her hand. It felt as if her own heart had stopped during those endless moments of willing him back to life. Then he opened his eyes, blinking hard, the whites filling with tiny splotches of blood. Some honeymoon, he'd said, his voice hoarse and scratchy. Grace had started crying then, shaking and weeping and generally making a fool out of herself. He had wrapped his arms around her and everything was all right again. It was the first time in her life she had felt true terror. The first time she'd actually had something to lose that she couldn't live without. Chapter 29 The Great Divide. What happened? Alex asked when Jimmy paused for breath. He had just gotten to the part in the story where Maeve's brother killed the two Callistians and ordered Maeve to follow him or die. Grace slipped off the radiator, her butt growing numb, and crossed over to stand beside Jimmy. He slid his hand over her arm, intertwining his fingers with hers. Well, now. After a suitable pause to build suspense, Jimmy continued his carefully edited version of Maeve's story. Maeve and Lothar fought all that day and into the night. It was an exaggeration, Grace knew, but the kids were rapt, hanging on his every word. Maeve was smaller than her brother, but she was skilled and she had the special sword the Callistians had forged for her. Finally, Maeve forced Lothar's sword from him, had him down, her blade at his throat. Did she kill him? Kat shifted, the blanket falling aside as she slid to the edge of the chair. Worse, Jimmy said in a low, groaning voice. What a ham. A ghost telling a ghost story, how fitting. She walked away. Walked away. She decided that the worst punishment would be to leave him to his own companions. He lay there, bleeding, wounded, and they pounced on him. Did they eat him too? Alex added. Grace shook her head at the boy's gruesome sense of humor. Cannibals seemed to hold no fear for the kids. Maeve took the women and children and returned to the Callista settlement. There they flourished during the year without sun. The end, Grace interjected. The children didn't need to know the rest. Not tonight at least. Time for bed. The kids flopped back, then Kat sat up again. Wait. What was the treasure? How did it save the world when Grace found it again? Grace took over the storytelling, otherwise they'd be there all night. When the sun finally returned months later, Maeve and the others decided to split up. Some of the Callista wanted to try to sail home. The rest followed Maeve to a new home near where she once ruled. She left the treasure on the island and gave the leader of each group a map so that they could lead future generations to it, if needed. A map? How'd a piece of paper last 3,000 years? Kat asked. Did they have paper back then? Maybe they carved it on a stone, Alex suggested. Maeve wouldn't be carrying around a hunk of stone. She carved it onto her knife, Grace answered them. The knife I took from her tomb. It was fashioned of a special metal alloy unknown in Maeve's time, before the Callista arrived, that is. Her sword was made of the same material, much lighter, sharper, stronger than Lothar's. That's how she was able to defeat him. Plus she was smarter and better than him, Kat said. Then she turned to Grace. Where was the treasure hidden? What was it? We had clues to where the island was from Maeve's manuscript. Once I realized that the markings on the knife were a map, I found the treasure hidden in a sea cavern, halfway up a cliff. And about got yourself killed climbing up there to get it, Jimmy put in from his place beside Alex. Did not. Besides, you were the fool who almost drowned. Grace wrinkled her nose at him. He harumphed in response. Grace shot him a glare. He'd almost died that day, yet he always joked about it whenever he told the story. Of course, back then, how were they to know that Jimmy's days were numbered? The scent of blood filled her mind and for a moment her own screams drowned out the other sounds in the room. She shook herself free of the memories. Jimmy was giving her that same half grin, but his eyes narrowed in concern. The kids watched them both eagerly. So what was the treasure? Alex asked. Just a bunch of seeds, Jimmy said laconically, his fingers wrapping around hers and giving her hand a squeeze, which she returned. Alex sat upright in bed. Seeds? That was the treasure. No way. Well, There was also the secret of how to make the metal alloy. Maeve could have used that to arm her people, could have conquered the known world, especially with others weakened from the 2 years without a harvest. But she didn't. Instead she united the people in peace, shared the seeds. Maize and legumes all designed to grow faster and with less light. The Callista bred them for their long sea voyages so that they could stop for a short while, grow more food and move on. That's how they were able to circle the world 3,000 years before anyone else. Maize and legumes. What's maize and legumes? Alex asked. Corn and beans, Grace told him with a smile. The same ones that they are now growing in famine areas across the world. The places hit hardest when Tambora erupted. So the treasure did save millions even 3,000 years after it saved Maeve's people. No way, corn and beans. Yuck. Alex made a sour face. I wouldn't eat them if my life depended on them. Guess you're lucky you don't have to worry about that. Now, time for bed. No, Kat cried out. Grace turned to her and was surprised to see she was shaking, her legs drawn up to her chest. That can't be the end. Kat, what's wrong? I don't want it to end, I don't want to go back. She drew in a shuddering breath and turned her face to Grace. Please, don't make me go back there. Grace rushed around the bed to take the girl into her arms. You're not going back. But my surgery, don't worry, sweetheart. Grace pulled the blanket up over Kat's shoulders. In the morning I'll talk to Hellman, tell him to leave you down here with Alex until your surgery. Really? Kat looked up at Grace, her eyes wide with hope. Promise. I promise. I'll make sure you don't have to go anywhere near the ECU again. Thanks, Grace, Kat mumbled, her eyes drooping. Jimmy was glaring at her, but Grace studiously ignored him. She leaned forward and planted a kiss on Kat's forehead. The girl was so exhausted that she was asleep within seconds. Alex's snores filled the room a few minutes later. We need to talk, Jimmy said, gesturing to the door. Grace crept past the 2 sleeping youngsters, and they slipped outside into the quiet corridor. Alex's room was at the far end of the pediatric wing, as far away from the nurse's station as you could get. A small alcove with cleaning supplies and a sink sat across the hallway. Grace left Alex's door ajar and beckoned for Jimmy to join her there, out of sight of any passerby. You can't go to Hellman, Jimmy began. He'll lock you up. Have you committed and sent off for his miracle surgery before you could say boo? Sure, hold your voice down. It's all right. I was already planning to see him in the morning. Jimmy's bushy eyebrows drew together in a frown. What? Why? Grace, you can't. She lay a finger against his lips to quiet him. Then noticed that it was trembling and quickly drew it away. Not before he saw, though. He gathered her into his arms, held her tight, the beat of his heart echoing through her. God, this was so hard, the hardest thing she'd ever done, harder even than losing him the first time. Her breath shuddered through her body as she fought her tears. Jimmy wasn't helping any, whispering nonsense to her in Gaelic as if she were a child frightened by things that go bump in the night. Because in Grace's world, things that went bump in the night were all too real. At last she understood why he had been sent back. There were some things that she could not do alone. She pushed back, gaining some space. I need you to stay with them, protect them. I can't be 2 places at once, Jimmy. His frown deepened into a glower. You think I crossed heaven and earth to play nanny? Grace, no. It's the only way. Hellman is on the ethics committee. He can guarantee Alex gets what he needs and that Kat is taken care of. He can see that Eve Warden is stopped. I have to go to him. Let me. You stay here with the kids. Alex needs you, can't you see that? Why would Hellman listen to you? I'll make him listen, damn it. She shook her head mournfully. No. I have something he wants. I can give him the chance to make history. He'll bargain for that. He pulled her tight against his body once more. There has to be another way. There must be. She burrowed into the warm comfort of his chest, allowing herself to drift in a universe that existed solely of the two of them. How long had she dreamed about a moment like this? It was still so difficult to believe that he was actually here, that she wasn't dreaming. She wished this moment could last forever. The sound of Alex's coughing drifted across the hall to them. Jimmy kissed the crown of her head, then released her. We'll find a way, he whispered, his fingers stroking her cheekbone. Not trusting her voice, Grace merely nodded. They returned to Alex's room. Jimmy sat with him, patiently collecting tissues filled with wads of bright green mucus, as Grace got the boy some water. A few moments and half a box of Kleenex later, Alex was breathing normally again. He lay back against his pillow and patted either side of the bed for Grace and Jimmy to join him. He pivoted his head, staring at Jimmy with an earnest expression. What's it like, dying? Alex asked Jimmy. Grace shook herself, reached to the chair beside her to check on Kat. The only light in the room came from the red exit sign over the door, but that was enough for her to see that Kat still slept peacefully, hadn't heard the question. Jimmy cleared his throat, his eyes meeting Grace's above Alex's head. Don't you think that's a topic best discussed in the light of day? Alex gave a small humph, unconsciously mimicking Jimmy. No one ever wants to talk about what really matters. But you're a ghost, aren't you? I mean, if you're Grace's Jimmy, you must be, so who better to ask? Jimmy stammered. Alex, why would you think Jimmy is a ghost? Grace asked when she found her voice. I googled you when you were over with Kat earlier, Alex explained as if his assumption was perfectly rational. His picture was in the news story. He swiveled his head back toward Jimmy once more. Along with his obituary. Busted. Jimmy chuckled. Damn technology. So, Alex repeated with great patience, enunciating each word, what's it like, dying? Jimmy gave Grace a silent shrug. It's all right, she said. Go ahead, tell him. She wrapped her hand around Alex's shoulder, found herself holding her breath, waiting for Jimmy's answer. Jimmy reached his hand to hers. Their wedding bands glowed red in the dim light, two embers of a dying fire. Well now, he began, clearing his throat, what do you think it's like? Alex shifted his weight in irritation. Why do adults always answer a question with a question? It's a trick he learned from a friend of ours, Brother Leo, Grace answered. No friend of mine, Jimmy retorted. Is it like falling asleep? Alex continued, drawing their attention back to his question. Or more like a blink of an eye, 1 second you're here and the next, you're gone. Neither, both. Grace and Alex both turned their heads to stare at Jimmy. Have you ever thrown a rock into a pond, watched the ripples? So it's like drowning. Like falling. Jimmy shook his head. No. Death is in the ripples. At first they are close together, and you think you can hold on to everything. How you looked, what the world around you looked like, music, smells, memories. But then the ripples spread farther and farther apart, and you begin to lose bits of yourself. The work that you spent a lifetime on, that's now gone over there, lodged between those bits of atoms making up that window. Your favorite song, that's floating up in the clouds making the rain falling over your grave. The woman you love. He trailed off, his fingers squeezing Grace's hand so tightly she almost winced in pain. She heard his breath catch before he began again. The woman you love, you hold tight to that, but by now you're dead and gone long enough that the ripples have taken you across the solar system, and beyond, so that now you're part of a new galaxy just forming, and the ripples that once made you whole are as much a part of millions of other lives as they are of you. You can't remember who you are or why you were, but you hold on to that one minuscule piece of yourself. And he turned his face to Grace's, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. Sometimes that small piece of yourself is enough to lead you back home. Jimmy laid his lips against the silent tears that streamed down Grace's cheek. Alex sat in thought for a moment, then straightened, breaking their embrace. New galaxies. I could be part of a star or life on another planet or something. His voice held the excitement that only a child could bring to such a morbid topic. That's not too bad, better than some of the stories I've read. Zombies and vampires and stuff. He shot a look at Jimmy. And ghosts. But for a ghost, you're all right. Thank you, Jimmy acknowledged the boy's approval with a nod and a smile. But you know, I'm pretty special for a ghost. Only a few are strong enough to return at all, and only a very, very rare breed can find their body again. Of course, most of those are driven crazy by the shock of it all. Alex's eyes went wide. Crazy? You mean there are crazy ghosts walking around? Doing what? They go mad with desire to remain here on Earth, Jimmy whispered, two boys sharing tales from the crypt. Jack the Ripper was one. Whoa, Alex breathed out. I don't want to be one of those. How do we know you're not like them? Stop it, you two, Grace interrupted. Jimmy, tell him the truth. I am, Jimmy protested. It's all true. And I'm not like Jack the Ripper, he assured Alex. How come a bad guy like him isn't in hell? It's all one and the same universe. Alex almost bounced with indignation. No way. That's not right. That's not fair. Jimmy's chuckle rang through the room, and Grace was reminded of her own similar protestations earlier this evening. She still didn't understand. Part of her wanted there to be a righteous ending for people like Jack the Ripper and Lucas Redding. Or people who misuse their power over innocents, like Eve Warden. A painful, righteous ending. I'm told that there's no provision in creation to guarantee fair, Jimmy replied, his brogue thickening as if he were mimicking someone else. But there is free will. And those who use their freedom to make wrong choices. Like Jack the Ripper, Alex supplied. Like Jack the Ripper. And others, Jimmy added, his eyes staring into Grace's. Ones who choose to harm, to squander their life, their hope. Grace wrinkled her nose at him, assuring Jimmy that his not-so-veiled reference to her thoughts of suicide hadn't gone unnoticed. Those people don't just slide into the pond of the hereafter, gently separating, dissipating into eternity. What happens? Alex asked, his hands scrunching the blanket into a tiny ball. They get burned up, right? Wham, bam, shazam. And they are gone, they can't ever come back again after. Right? Jimmy nodded, considering the boy's words. Vaporized, atomized, vanquished, vanished. Vanished, smashed, crashed, squashed. Alex joined in the litany of destruction. Eroded, corroded, exploded, Pam. He bounced his fist off the bed with the last, a look of glee on his face, as if he alone were responsible for vanquishing all evil from the universe. Pam. Jimmy echoed. Grace sat in silence, shaking her head at her two boys. Only men could consider this any kind of rational conversation to be carrying on at 3 a.m. Of course, who was she to judge rational? So how did you make it back? Alex persisted in his questioning. Will I be able to do it? I dunno. I came back under special circumstances. With the help of an old friend and Grace and the spring solstice. I have just 1 day left on this earth. His words echoed through Grace's heart as if with each beat, she was losing him for good. Again. Alex's breath whistled out in a wheeze. She ran her fingers through his hair, readjusted the oxygen that had slipped away in his excitement. There wasn't much time left for either him or Jimmy. Hours for the one, days, maybe weeks at most for the other. And still they sat there, grinning and conniving, trying their best to outwit death. As if it were a game. Her mouth tightened and she swallowed hard, reached for Jimmy's hand once more. After all that trouble, that's all? Alex sounded disappointed. Only one day. One day. Sunset to sunset. Then I'm gone back to the void. Grace shivered. That's enough. No more talk of death or voids. Is your heart racing? This is just the tip of the iceberg. Subscribe to our channel, and don't miss a single thrilling twist in Grace's story.